So, hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Corrigan. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute for Ethics and Artificial Intelligence at the Technical University of Munich. The TUM IEAI hosts a variety of events with experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. These events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch in 2019, we've already been able to run over 60 events with distinguished guests from all over the world. Today's event speaks to a topic we have been engaging with over the past couple years and is growing in terms of urgency and importance every day and changing every day, which is what we were just talking about. Building off of our Munich Security Council side event last February on AI and human security, where we specifically discussed the impact of AI on civilians and non-combatics in both conflict and crisis settings. Today we want to kind of continue that conversation, but also take it to a more international dynamic as it relates to AI in the military and also for global security, and how this emerging technology is kind of changing the international scene, both in conflict settings, but also thinking about security more broadly. So the event today, thinking about ethical use of AI in the military, implications for organizations and for global security. We have the pleasure of having David Barnes and Lance Lindauer with us, who are both also visiting researchers here at the IEAI this year. So welcome to working with us this year. So Dave is a senior executive and preeminent authority on AI, strategic digital transformation, and innovative leadership with extensive military, academic, and technology experience. Dave has shaped organizational strategies and technological advancements in defense, healthcare, cybersecurity, and higher education. As the founder and CEO of Empowering AI, he empowers boards and senior leaders to capitalize on AI-driven opportunities, ensuring they align innovation with strategic objectives and operational excellence. Dave's pragmatic approach to digital transformation combines advanced governance frameworks and risk management techniques to unlock growth while addressing regulatory complexities. His distinguished career includes serving as professor, United States Military Academy, and Chief AI Ethics Officer for the U.S. Army AI Integration Center, where he spearheaded the Army's responsible AI strategy encompassing risk frameworks, education, and governance, and he advised organizations including the IEEE, DARPA, and NATO, and served as a fellow to Oxford University's Institute for Ethics and AI. His leadership and academic excellence demonstrates his proven ability to inspire high-performance teams, develop cross-enterprise solutions, and coach senior leaders in adapting to dynamic, technology-driven environments. And he currently serves as a visiting professor for our institute. Lance is a visiting affiliated researcher at the University of Cambridge Bennett School of Public Policy and here at the IEAI. Lance is co-founder and executive director emeritus of the Partnership to Advance Responsible Technology, PART, at a Pittsburgh-based NGO dedicated to the responsible research, development, and deployment of governance of AI systems used to address global challenges across society. He's also a founding partner of the Genius Research Group, an R&D firm dedicated to emerging technology innovation with public sector domains. Lance spent nearly a decade at the RAND Corporation, serving in roles such as Director of Operations for RAND's National Defense Research Institute and an innovation consultant. He served a stint in the U.S. Department of Treasury and has been an adjunct professor of intelligence analysis. Lance has a Master's of Business Administration from West Virginia Wesleyan College and a Master's of Public and International Affairs from the University of Pittsburgh. Yeah, me too. Where he was a U.S. Department of Education Foreign Language Area Study Fellow. He was awarded with the West Virginia Wesleyan College Alumni Achievement Award in 2024. So we're going to start with some questions. We have two really exciting guests here, and we were talking about how one of the things the IEAI really wants to do is more and more bridge kind of the work we're doing in this research setting with work that's going on outside of academia as well, especially when we're talking about a topic like we are today with international relations and global security. So we're hoping Lance and Dave can bring some perspectives to that. And please, again, this is a small group. We can chime in, bring your own opinions. We want to kind of bring this discussion outside of just the expertise we have here on the stage. So I have some questions to start it off, but we will quickly move to any questions you all have. So I just want to set the scene a little. On Monday at the UN General Assembly, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa talked about this call for red lines in AI. She said that humans must agree on clear red lines in AI before the technology reshapes society beyond our understanding and destroys the foundations of our humanity. So this is the biggest UN event of the year. AI is taking front stage. And not only that, but there are very few specific things actually called for in this call. And one of the things that it actually did explicitly talk about was prohibiting lethal autonomous weapons, autonomous replication of AI systems, and the use of AI for nuclear warfare. So some of the top threats within this call for red lines are very related to global security, as well as international affairs and power relations. So I want to start to either of you, or maybe Dave first. How do you think AI, such as autonomous decision-making systems, agentic AI, Gen AI, and some of the kind of examples that Ms. Ressa said as well, has they changed the security landscape?
So absolutely. First off, just thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be able to engage with everybody. So when you think about the military, but more broadly the security landscape, you need to also remember that as exciting and transformative AI seems to be, the security landscape is much like an old song. The tune sort of remains the same, right? Or a poem, there's a certain rhyme to it that continues. As Clausewitz even said, right? The nature of war never changes, right? As it continues. But the concern on the impact to humanity, which is driving this proposal for red lines, extends beyond the hype of AGI, the hype of losing all the jobs. It's that there may be important decisions relevant in the broad security space that should be left only to human decision makers. And so the question is, how much do we let artificial intelligence, with its ability to not only help inform people making those decisions, but may be able to be empowered to make decisions and replace the human decision maker? That becomes this really scary place for many people. And so when we think about what the current and changing environment is today, it's much like across any other sector. You want to gain those efficiencies. You want to do things at cost savings. You want to enable and empower decision makers to make better decisions. But there's also this resistance to, well, maybe we'll just let it do it for us. And what then what it looks like in the future, in particular, as right now, only those countries and those regions in the world are fully resourced to be able to capitalize on what limited use we have for AI today, and when we're not hearing all the rest of the voices. And so will that dynamic even further extend and spread out? And so you end up generating even a further gap, which in a sense might actually add complexity to the security environment instead of adding some order, which you think AI might be able to bring.
Mm-hmm. Lance, any follow-up thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So just wanted to echo what Dr. Barnes was saying. Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, Caitlin, and to the Institute for hosting us, not only today, but for the upcoming year. We're looking forward to it and got a lot of great ideas to spin up. So just to add to what Dr. Barnes was saying here, I think the big conversation that people are having, especially with respect to when you think about the word safety or the word national security, militarization, et cetera, is this argument of people are saying we're in an AI arms race, which immediately kind of connotates conflict. Like we're immediately trying to get to some sort of like global world domination, which for certain states and for certain people, that might be their primary focus, what they're thinking about. But I've seen a conversation try to be shifted away from that for more positive measures and think of it more as like sort of just great power competition, like states are competing with one another for economic purposes, for social reasons, et cetera. So even just shifting the narrative a little bit away from an AI arms race, think back to the, obviously the space race or the nuclear arms race, to think more just towards power competition. Now, that might just be wishful thinking by somebody that tends to come up with things that are more altruistic, but shifting the narrative a little bit in that direction could just be a really helpful like level setter. And what I think is interesting to some of the questions here is how not only are states going to be competing with one another as we're thinking about this from states, but sub-state actors and regions are becoming really influential in this grand power competition as well, most notably the private sector. So when you're thinking about how much emerging technology is influencing how states conceive of not only military means, but non-military means as well, Silicon Valley, Singapore, places around the world are extraordinarily influential. People regions, companies, private sector companies are actually gaining a lot of power when in the past it used to just reside really at the state level. And so now my question that I find to be really interesting is how are these Palantirs, these the OpenAIs, the NVIDIAs, the Oracle, like how are these private sector entities going to be impacting this security question as well going forward at the state level? Because you have, talking about the United States specifically, Washington, D.C. is looking west to Silicon Valley a lot of times saying, what should we do? What technology are you coming up with? How can we fold this into some of our military means versus the other way around? So I think that's going to be a really interesting area to keep an eye on, is how are non-state actors going to be really playing a role in this military security question?
To follow up on that, I mean, you've seen a lot of, with this race kind of rhetoric, you see a lot of reference to things, I don't know, like space race or nuclear arms race. Like how different is kind of the setting than kind of these more classic, maybe global security issues we've talked about before? Can we really compare it to how we've thought about things like nuclear arms or other technologies that have changed the way global security operates?
Yeah, just for a quick second, I think it can be paralleled in a large amount of the avenues to talk about. But the one thing that makes this a little bit different is technology, AI's ubiquity now, especially with the release of agentic AI, kind of to your question. It's now in sort of everybody's hands. So like my mom, who doesn't even have a flip phone, or a smartphone, sorry, she has a flip phone, is able to access an agentic AI tool just on her laptop, along with any lawmaker around the world. And so kind of comparing it to, like, say, the nuclear arms race, people don't have access to like nuclear weapons and uranium and things along those lines. So the fact that it's extraordinarily ubiquitous, yes, you have to have on-ramps and you have to have deep knowledge, et cetera, but its ubiquity makes it a little bit more, not scary, just interesting and worth watching and worth putting up some, we could talk about this a little bit later, whether they're guardrails or guidelines or et cetera. I think its ubiquity makes it just a little bit different and more modern. Dave, did you?
I mean, one of the things that I would add is, right, because it's ubiquitous and everyone will have their hand in it, it also is coming with a lot of overpromise, right? So AGI is going to be here tomorrow. All of our decision making is going to be immediately affected. There's a growing sense of FOMO, right? Yes, certainly on the battlefield space with legal autonomy, but also across all the different sectors, depending on where you sit in the industry. But when we start making comparisons, and this is where it begins to become, I think, a little less helpful to say the nuclear arms race, et cetera, is in terms of those red lines, coming back to that, what does that actually mean? What then do you do when something crosses the red line? How do you know when you actually cross that red line? Speaking of AGI, how are we going to know when we actually reach general intelligence, as an example? And the concern about the proliferation of the technology. If you're trying to control different aspects of it, certainly it seems to be ubiquitous from like the large language models perspective, et cetera. But if AI is rather simply put, right, a three-legged stool of the algorithm, the data, right, and the computing power, how then do you put restrictions on export license of those various things, right? We try to do with the CHIP Act, right? We're going to try to limit the potential adversaries, competitors gaining an advantage by controlling computing power. It's a lot different than trying to control the uranium enrichment, right, which is a lot more, in the physical space. And so the other piece of it is all these conversations tend to treat AI as it's a thing in and of itself. And that, I don't think, is the most accurate way to describe it yet. It's more, and it's not even a tool, it's an ecosystem of tools that enable other systems, right? Whether we're talking in the security sector or, the concerns are having AI controlling a state's nuclear arsenal, as an example. It's the nuclear arsenal, right? Not necessarily the AI itself, but then how does the AI potentially change that dynamic, the systems, the decision-making, et cetera, that go into that? So treating it less so as a thing in of itself and more as a way that it's going to allow different systems to do quicker, perhaps even faster than human decision making. That's, I think, is what the critical juncture becomes.
One thing, I mean, being that we're at a research organization here and have a lot of researchers in the room, what caught me about, and I saw you, as mentioned in your bio, working with things like DARPA. What is the thinking about the AI development in this area that may be different than, for instance, I mean, you said working with companies in Silicon Valley and the government having to look to that. I mean, it's not new that the government has to work with researchers, right? I mean, the atomic bomb was also developed with a lot of researchers, but much more maybe controlled by the government in some way. So how does this, maybe this relationship, or for how researchers can kind of get involved with these kind of government-led initiatives, or are they really just taking a back seat, right? And it's very separate.
Well, and that, Lance, I know has some perspective dealing more with seeing the Pittsburgh landscape in terms of the interaction between academia and the industry there. And I don't speak on behalf of DARPA in this space, but one of the things that we've noticed over the last few decades is it's shifted from the government being the greatest funder and having the brain trust to be able to develop the new technology. Think about all the trickle-down technological advances we got from the space program, right, from NASA, et cetera, where the expertise is really, we've begun to believe, is in the private sector. And so, especially if we feel that we're in an arms race, we feel like, that we are getting behind, then we want to rely on where the technology, where the best research is happening, and it seems to be happening in the academic space. But what you see in all these different events are representatives from different groups of stakeholder. The public sector, academia, and the private sector all seeming to speak the same language but talking past each other. And so one of the things that we stress when we were working with the Army before, and we continue to do so in our work, is how do you get improved collaboration between those different groups? Right? So where's the academic focus? Is it exactly the same place that the public sector is? Is it the same place the private sector? So how do you magnify the expertise within those sectors, right? Where identified common friction points, but perhaps it's the academic side is looking more over the horizon. Private sector is looking at the immediate, like what we can, the technology we can have today and tomorrow. And the public sector is very real into looking longer term, but also has to deal with day-to-day crises. And is there a way to generate improved collaboration amongst those different groups? And I think that important triangle is really essential, even within any organization, but in particular in the security sector.
Yeah, just two quick brief thoughts there. And as Caitlin said, feel free to ask questions, make this extraordinarily conversational. Yeah, raise your hand, we'll run a mic up or however. Just the two quick thoughts. Number one, I think you are seeing not just the conversation has been going for the past couple of years, especially when you think about like responsible and ethical uses of RAI, which became a cottage industry in and of itself. The notion now is how do you get a lot of like interdisciplinary thought into these conversations? And so it's moved beyond conversation, and now you actually have companies posting RAI positions. You have companies seeking to have ethics folks at the forefront of some of their like decision-making tech investments, et cetera. So number one is like this interdisciplinary nature. There's a huge need for formally trained researchers such as yourselves to contribute to this conversation. And then the second thing that I would say is, time moves constantly forward, but like pendulum swing. So right now, especially from the United States, I'm currently living in the UK. In the UK, there's this pendulum swinging, like there's a lot of conversation about the state receding, whether it's from funding initiatives, whether it's from wanting to have more isolationist perspectives compared to like cooperative movements on international stages for technology or for a variety of different subjects. So that, in my opinion, that's where then researchers sort of like fill this void. And, sometimes it's cyclical. It's every 4 years. Maybe, just speaking from the United States, we have 4 years of retrenchment from the public sector. Then you see a lot of space for researcher thought, academic thought, private sector investment move forward. Then if the pendulum swings a little bit more and the public sector tends to take a more aggressive stance, then you're already there with the thoughts. You're already there with some of the technology. So I actually see this as a I'm always a glass half full type of person anyways. So like really dig deep into some of these thinkings. And even Dave and I were talking about over breakfast this morning. Public sector sometimes not only it doesn't know what it doesn't know what it needs. And so this is where I think like a lot of formal research can be happening on these topics, including in the military perspective, but in other markets as well. So I see this as a period of like stepping forward and getting those ideas coalesced.
Moving to one of the other points I wanted to definitely spend some time on is thinking about the uncertain regulatory environment around AI impact, the constantly evolving environment here, particularly when we're thinking about the complications of deploying across international borders, working with multinational environments like NATO, and certainly I'll bring in one of the other points we wanted to get to, but I'll already bring it here, the dual use nature of AI, right? And what that means from a kind of regulatory perspective. Mohamed, I invite you to say something too if you have any thoughts, but maybe we'll start out with Lance and Dave and any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, any thoughts? Oh, do you have something to say to start?
You can think about it. I'll let you
Oh, okay, perfect, yeah.
He's our regulatory expert.
Yeah, wonderful.
I'm going to let him chime in at some point.
Yeah. So I'll just start with a couple thoughts. Like I think initially, and you know, everybody in this room knows that there's no global, common, binding, enforceable, mutually agreed upon regulation that says everybody in the entire world, every citizen, every company, every state, et cetera, will use AI in these specific given realms. You know, we have lots of different executive orders, we have toolkits, we have guidelines, we have acts, you know, that are a variety of different means. But until there is some sort of commonly accepted, and we may never get there, likely we'll probably never get there, until there's some commonly accepted global norms, this is going to be a really interesting question in terms of like varying regulatory statutes. So we have to talk about balance, and we have an imbalance of, Oksana, did you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yes, but I want to use an
Sure, yeah, wonderful. So there's a large imbalance that's going to occur. Again, we have talks. I know, Caitlin, I really applaud for you guys doing a lot of work, even thinking about like AI, responsible AI in Africa, for example. The divide between, you know, the global north and the global south, the challenges and changes that we have in between social norms and different starting points with technology readiness levels and abilities of public sectors to be enforceable units as opposed to, you know, non-corruptible units, et cetera. I mean, the conversation goes on and on about this imbalance here. I think that what's really interesting is how do you find, you brought up international organizations like NATO and obviously the UN General Assembly, which you started off your comments. The question that I would kind of rhetorically pose, but I'd be happy to hear anybody's thoughts out there, is if you don't have the ability to pull together multiple nations, whether it's 32 in NATO or 193 at the UN or give another organization, World Health Organization, World Economic Forum, to have some of these collaborative conversations in these international platforms, where are these conversations going to happen? Where are these agreements going to be established that are going to be more than just like the word in the United States right now is deals? Where are these bilateral deals going to happen? Like, where are these conversations going to take place where you can find some sort of commonality? You brought up governance, talking specifically about military, but I really have given a lot of thought to like, what's the utility? What's the purpose? How are these international organizations specific to military like NATO? What role are they going to play going forward? And so I think that's food for thought. And I definitely have some more comments, but I'm really anxious to hear what others had to say. So is it easy to pass the microphone?
Right. So my question is, do you really think we need new norms though? Because you started talking about we need a new norm, we need a new kind of agreement between everyone that we do not have. To be fair, I don't think we have it for anything. But there are norms that I think we kind of all roughly agreed on, such as don't send nukes to each other because otherwise the others are going to send nukes and it's a problem. And there might be others that I'm just not aware of. But should we not just try to find a common denominator where we all already agreed and then apply it to AI? Because I don't believe AI is like a new problem. It's just in the sense of not everything about it is new. When it comes to values, maybe we can build on what we already have.
No, I think that point is absolutely fantastic. And in a sense, this is probably one of the spaces that we have some disagreement on, because I absolutely think that we don't need a lot of new regulation. I think, in particular, in the next few decades, current regulation that we have and the norms associated with that reflect how AI might be used in different fields, right? So I just came last week from the World Medical Innovation Forum held in Boston, right? So very focused on the healthcare area, but an increasing, unsurprising, focus on artificial intelligence. And when you think about the regulation in that space, one question to ask, and I think that's really underpinning what you're offering here, is does the current regulation, is it sufficient, right, to regulate the new technology, or do we need something in addition to that, right? You know, so we do some word changes here or there. Is that going to be enough, or do we need something completely adding to it? The problem with trying to have regulation in the AI space, unless you have identified the specific set of use cases that you're focused on, it's, I think, almost near impossible to have regulation that's going to work, right? That's viable, right? That's verifiable, et cetera, in that space. But others may disagree with that. But I also think, and we saw this at the UN, right? Trying to find that common space that we have all agreement on, even if we agree on the values that seem to be universal, how to implement them, that's where, you know, state and non-state actor, the self-interest comes into play, as well as for other reasons, right? Even the most well-intended, there's going to be disagreement in that space. In the meantime, time keeps going. So we might all agree with the proposal of having that red line as an example. But then coming back to my earlier point, well, how then do we expect it to work with that? Is it weapons because of the lack of human decision-making at some point in those systems? Is that really what's the crux of it? Or is it, you know, can that weapon be employed in accordance with international humanitarian law? And so what you have is many state actors feel that it's the second. As long as that weapon system can be used within IHL, it should not be forbidden. On the other side, people say, well, because of the lack of human decision-making, that there's no way that it can conform to IHL, or that we need something in addition to. But right, these are those deep philosophical, more open questions that we need to come to some agreement to before I think we can have the regulation that many people desire.
Yeah, just one more like follow-up point. To be clear, like I'm not calling for like new global regulation, because I think that that's just impossible. What I'm really calling for is new approaches to finding, I like to call it like going back to like statistical days at Pitt, like the line of best fit. So like in regression analysis. So think about NATO in the military setting. You have 32 different member countries with 32 different leadership groups, 32 different sets of norms or cultural characteristics or whatever you want to call them, leaders, personalities, et cetera. So if you scatter plot that on a graph, how do you find, basically, how do you minimize the standard deviation of every single one of those? You have to come to some agreement somewhere, somehow, about how to address Russian encroachments on your airspace, or you have to come to some agreement about cybersecurity attacks, et cetera. So that's what I think is really necessary, and I don't think we're there yet. So the new approach is, again, you have a lot of decision makers, I think, in power that don't understand the technology itself. So you're finding that to be a really challenging, how do you even begin to put the foundations in place? But one other thing, building on what you were just saying, Dave, is this notion of, and that's why I'm glad the philosopher is sitting here, is when you're talking about, like, you were saying, what is, Oksana, what is, you know, commonly agreed upon with some and disagreed upon with others. We had this debate a lot whenever we were working together with the Army about like ethics versus responsibility. Well, like, what is ethical to one leader or one, say, group of people or one company might be unethical to someone else. And there was a lot of variance in that discussion, whereas like if you wanted to key on like responsibility, there was a lot of people that would say, well, we want our tech to be responsible because like irresponsible technology is just probably bad technology to begin with. So nobody's going to want to buy that in general. So even the verbiage, even the approaches are really, really important. So your question is like super, super prescient for sure.
Well, and related to that, you know, So Les is also referring to, one of the principles, reliability, that we have in the Department of War now concerning the ethics of artificial intelligence. And so I almost asked rhetorically to an audience of even those who are building the technology is how many people want to develop unreliable technology? And everyone laughs at that and chuckles, right? And I said, well, you're already doing responsible AI, so continue doing what you're doing, right? Because there was sort of this pushback, this idea that any sort of regulation, any sort of compliance would be overly burdensome and stifle innovation in some sort of way. All right, so that's an area of concern. The other piece of it, when we talk about responsible innovation and integrated into our systems, you get the North and South. Everyone sort of agrees, right? It seems to be sort of a common value. It's about the implementation part is really the disagreement. And so who has the responsibility burden? Is it those who build the technology or those who use it? And I think we would all agree that the answer is both, right? Both have, and it's a shared responsibility. But when you actually pin down people who represent different groups, let's say the policymakers, well, their view is like, well, they'll build us the technology in a responsible way. That's the presumption. And then you ask those who are actually, in the DevSecOps groups, right? And they're like, well, we're innovating and we're being on the cutting edge. How you employ it is not my decision, right? You've given me the use case. I'm going to make it the best possible, most efficient sort of a technology I can. That's not my role. And you can see where that dichotomy sort of ends up playing out, where it ends up being perhaps nobody is really responsible. And so then you take that sort of general sort of view, and now you look at these specific cases, and it becomes even more complex when you're dealing with some thorny international debates and discussion, right? Where states' power might be waning overall, but even the states' elements of power, right, are diplomatic, information, military, and economic, and how in each of those four pillars, right, each of those elements, how that dynamic shifts when you're having a conversation about AI and how it's going to impact.
It made me think of another compounding factor of this conversation. So one of the things I mentioned was the dual use, which I think has come up in different ways around how we've already discussed it, but also the nature of the actors involved in when we're talking about global security, military use, all these things, that the end user or the deployer is often not a company or a private organization, but the state itself, right? So what does that mean for accountability and how regulation will work? And these type of situations.
Yeah, I think that looking at AI as dual use is absolutely spot on. I think it's even more multifaceted than the dual use nature of it. But this comes to play out in a number of areas. Certainly we're thinking, okay, one that could be used for civilian purposes, perhaps, to the wider public, but could also perhaps be being used on the military side. But even within the military context itself, there could be multi-use. So a couple points. One is when you look at least state militaries, you have to think of a large enterprise, right? The United States Department of War is one of the largest enterprises globally. And so the technology, how we're thinking about leveraging AI, is everything from what we might say the back office to the battlefield. So the healthcare system within the U.S. Department is larger than almost any other hospital systems globally, right? And so those same issues seem to come up. But even back at that medical forum that I was at, questions about developing new med tech, does it follow under the med tech sort of piece? Does it follow under potentially new AI regulations? Like what then, and how then do you navigate that space? If you're interested in saying recording and helping clinicians do their clinical notes, right? Think of the time savings, et cetera, using a chatbot to assist with that. Well, that same large language model foundationally may be one that is used elsewhere, right? That's supporting, so perhaps a military commander and their ADM process, their decision-making process. And so it's the same foundational model, right? It's then being fine-tuned into those specific use cases. Or when you're looking at a radiologist and looking at x-rays, right? You still have the computer vision aspect of it, which is, by the way, a very similar process, algorithms, et cetera, that might be used in ATR process for an autonomous weapon system, right? So identifying, reacquiring, tracking a target. So it's really unusual. Like, how then do you want to, again, back to regulating that space, but recognizing that it's going to be elsewhere. And then on top of that, right, there's, within any organization, you're going to have this dynamic where you're going to have the process and policies for, say, use at TUM, and sort of what may be authorized for your students, for faculty, for research. And as you come out with, governance and whatnot for regulations with that as an organization, understand that there's shadow AI going on. So everyone is using it in a personal perspective, but to assist them in their work and as an academic in their research and et cetera. And so there's that sort of difference dynamic between sort of what's officially happening and then everyone's kind of using it on their own, which is, I think, another way of thinking about a dual use, which I hadn't thought about as much until recently. And then the last bit is speaking about the importance, coming back about where the academic community really comes into play in some research. I don't know if everyone saw that recently the MIT put out a report about Gen AI use in businesses, in US businesses. What they discovered is that 95 of the 35 to 45 billion that's been spent so far this year by businesses in the US on AI, 94 to 95% of them in those different companies never moved beyond the pilot stage, never got it to scale. Which is really incredible, right? So there is this sort of gap going on there. But notice that this is a lot of energy. This came up in a conversation I had yesterday with a panel of executives. They're all worried about how then do they scale this internally in their organizations. Well, it was through the research, right, from MIT that is helping to shine a light on this particular issue, as long with recommendations perhaps to how to amend that you're not getting from the private sector. Right? People are kind of reaching out on their own. So it's again, that potential for that collaboration, it's really important.
Yeah, two additional thoughts there. Dave really hit on the part when you think about in military context from backroom to battlefield. A lot of people immediately want to jump to like lethal autonomy and think about autonomous systems and that nature. So much work is being done at the Department of War now in the United States about how to autonomously process VA claims for, veterans, or how to make paperwork be a little bit more streamlined in the back end. I mean, it's the non-glamorous stuff that's actually getting a huge bulk of investment. It's just you tend to hear about the other end of the spectrum. So I think the backroom to battlefield, DoD nature to civilian impacts, the dual use that you were saying, you talked about really well. So just elevating it up quickly at a macro level, kind of two thoughts. Number one, with respect to regulation, including here in the European Union, but then also in other various regions around the world, you're seeing these carve-outs for industry A, B, C, and D, carve out the military, carve out national security, carve out DoD, and there's a lot of everything but that in terms of regulation. And so where I actually think there tends to be a lot of promise is with these carve-outs, albeit hopefully done properly, where can innovation come that's not necessarily like you were talking about responsible regulation, responsible innovation, responsible guardrails. Like how can innovations be driven from the DoD that could then be dual use because there are so many carve out potentials and there isn't a lot of like initial regulation up front. So I think that there's some potential there. Again, has to be controlled within an environment. And then the other thing quickly to talk about is in the other direction, dual use. So think about DoD that has the potential to trickle into civilian life that has the potential to trickle into the military context perspective. I wrote it down because I happened to just be reading it yesterday. There was a recent Atlantic Council article talking about second order impacts. And it was just saying how with the increased governance discussion around AI and the increased regulatory structure around AI that's happening in the private sector, there's going to be second order impact on the military context and the defense sectors around the world. And so basically this article was saying, if DODs and MODs around the world are smart, they won't be passive passengers. They will want to be active participants in this conversation. So then there's not a conversation that happens at an academic level or a public sector regulatory level, or even in the private sector, that then gets placed over top of the DOD. And so, in other words, it was just saying, don't think you're special military context because you're carved out and you don't have necessarily like the lens on you. If you don't still participate in this conversation, then in the back end, you might actually be over-regulated where maybe it doesn't make sense. So don't have all the answers yet. It's still evolving, but it's a really intriguing thought to think about your dual use question, about dual use in a positive way, but second order effect maybe in the opposite way.
And I have another example, if I can, that help illustrate that, and that's when you think about the excitement over agentic AI, right? And we know that if you're building upon essentially some black box, deep learning ML, you have the problems with hallucinations with large language models, et cetera. But you think about from the military and security side, thinking about the desire to have more and more autonomous systems. So how then do you adequately do testing and evaluation on a system and be able to move through into verification and validation of those same systems for the particular use case, even if you're willing to, say, use it on the battlefield in high-risk places or in the medical field or not? Because there are certain elements when we think about these agentic systems that we desire them to have. How then do you generate sandboxes to be able to do this testing? And should this solely be something that the government is only responsible for? Well, what you might have is development of along two different paths, where it seems to be that's an area there we could have much better, closer collaboration, again, across the different, triad of industry, the academia sector and the public sector to work on this important space, because in a sense, regardless of the use case you're trying to do with these systems, there is a desire to be able to, in a sense, account for perhaps minimizing undesired or unknown consequences or the system results. So.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, I love how this conversation is like starting at like international relations theory, and now we have like org theory coming in and theories of public administration, and you really need kind of a interdisciplinary team even within kind of this discipline that we're in. I'm going to bring it over for a question here.
Thank you so much. I have a question about like speed and also regulation. I get the sense that kind of more regulation is not really sought after, at least by the two of you. And I get it, and I don't want to disagree, but I have the feeling that the situation might outrun us, especially on the actually lethal side. If you think about the iteration cycles of, let's say, drones in Ukraine, they work like 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. One side develops, the other side counters. And it gets to the point where they are now like running out of options besides like completely cutting all connection to the drone so it can work fully autonomously, because everything that is a connection will be jammed. At least that's a discussion that is ongoing, how much truth is in there, up for discussion. And I think we know that after something happened, like regulating it after the fact is much harder than doing it before. Are we running out of time in this regard? And even if we are running out of time, is there any chance that we can do something on this side, like on the regulatory side, that makes sense? So in like not taking away like chances of one side because we just want to be the good ones in this fight.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much to unpack in that very wise sort of question, right? Asking there, right? Because if you think first, are we running out of time? It could be if we need preemptive regulation, if we feel like we need that. But if you look in particular, to international cases of different kinds of weapon systems that have been employed on the battlefield, we've done post facto regulation, and they've been somewhat successful. So consider a biological and chemical ban, right? Although we've seen even recent use cases of those kind of weapons. Same with nuclear weapons, right? After the atomic bombs were already dropped. Not saying that that's the best way to do that, because obviously there was so much death destruction that occurred before that may have been prevented in that case. There's also the question of would the regulation actually be followed, right? Is it enforceable, and then who does it? But that goes with any sort of international regulation, right? So that's not necessarily new in this case. Now, in terms of fully autonomous lethal weapon systems, right? So fully autonomous laws. To be honest, I'm not necessarily against it. And part of the reason is, right, I am not convinced that adequate arguments have been made that are strong enough against it. I'm not saying that they're straw men. I just think that they're not sufficient in my mind to call for, at least to convince me. My primary concern is because of what you see in places like Ukraine, where you've got this action counteraction, and the innovation cycle is so narrow, and you're trying to do that because as soon as you make an improvement, run the patch, et cetera, or a new tactic or technique, the enemy has done something to counter that, right? And so you're into this constant place, and so we're moving, seems to be like almost inevitably closer and closer to it. My concern is that we build the technology and we field it before it's ready. So in a broad example, right, I mentioned earlier that I think as long as a system, even albeit fully autonomous, that could operate within IHL, right, could discriminate, operate under principle of distinction, could be proportionally, right, tracks with military necessity, perhaps even improves upon the human's ability to follow the principle of humanity, et cetera, I think that would be absolutely amazing, right? And you hear a lot of arguments about that in terms of like reasons to advocate the move to it. It's just that we may not wait for that, right? And so what you see is that we're going to, I think, potentially, and I think broadly across the international community, with different actors, they're going to rush and field the technology before it's able to do that. When we haven't really addressed the adequate need to understand unintended consequences that might come from it, perhaps it can't fully discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. So in a sense, it might violate international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict, et cetera. But either a state might feel that they have no compunction to follow it, or it could be the case that they might feel that there's such an existential crisis, right, that they have an opportunity to field this technology now, and let's do this because, in a sense, it's not an issue of not turning back. It's perhaps the only advantage in a limited window that I might have. And so, in other words, from my perspective, it's much more instrumental. But even those instrumental arguments, I think, might be reason enough not to rush into deploying those kinds of systems yet. Not saying we shouldn't continue to develop them and whatnot. I think that, there will continue to be a debate in that space, but that in that question whether it's inevitable or not, I'm not so sure, because I think to really be fully autonomous, the systems require a level of technological maturity to have agency, which they're not going to have anytime soon. But that's my perspective on that. But of course, if you listen to some of the big names in technology, they say, well, that's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think that's the case. But I think that then changes the conversation, because now we're not talking about mere artifacts and tools. We're talking about something that has some agency, and then questions about its moral agency. And now we get into a deeper debate, and can it make decisions analogously to the way a human does? Can it be held responsible in the same, right? There are a lot of other things that we might have to unpack if we get to that point. I think what we'll have is very sophisticated systems, much short of that ability. We might claim that they're fully autonomous because but in a sense, there's definitely a lot to unpack, and let's talk more about that. So I'd love to, yeah.
Just Yeah, just one thought, and then I saw there was a question, so just in interest of time. Again, being the optimist that I am, glass half full, it is the proverbial flying the plane and building it at the same time now, especially over the last 5 years with both the pandemic sort of showing us the importance of technology whenever we had to all be isolated, and then with generative AI's ubiquitous release to the population. So like this is really speeding up in a way that we haven't seen prior, which is natural in how technology's evolved. So this is the plug for research. This is the plug, Caitlin, that we were talking about a little bit before, is this is where the bright minds in this room are going to be the critical part when you look at the spectrum: research, development, deployment, governance. Though research, the furthest upstream, getting these ideas, you know, laid out, formalized, contextualized, and put forth. This is actually what to your point, I think this is the really important time for research to really lean in really like independent, unbiased ways. So a lot of work to do there. So yeah.
I mean, basically, like I had similar questions in the similar line. One of my friend has asked, like, usually, like I feel like these regulations usually hinder the growth and deployment of a technology. That's what you people have answered right now. And going ahead with those topics, right? I mean, when we say that military and AI are compliant with IEAI Act, right? Then does it a threat to the confidentiality of a military services or the operations? Because there needs to be a transparency, right? And there should be like a kind of assurance is needed what's really being happened within this AI system. So do you really believe in this kind of zero knowledge assurance, or is there any caveats coming to this military process?
I think Lance made the point earlier about the carve-outs in these different regulations, right? And so there's a carve-out for national security and military, even in the IEAI Act, right? And so what then does that do, right? And especially in terms of this dual use question, right? Because in a sense, you really can't develop the technology for the military purpose, for the use case, without relying on the civilian side. And so you're going to have that piece of the puzzle, which, in a sense, the member nations of the EU are wrestling with now, trying to ask that very question. But part of the problem, which I think reduces the effectiveness of the regulation, even when there's a common desire that's unified to regulate certain technology, the technology itself or the use of it, is finding common definitions. So, you know, if you haven't, you know, studied this or looked at this recently, is look at all the different definitions of AI, right? And so each agency, including the EU and the AI Act, has its own definition, which is a compromise between all the member countries, how they defined AI. That's the same thing with lethal autonomy or a fully autonomous weapon system or whatever. And so that debate is still continuing internationally of actually how to do it in a way that's not too broad, that it waters down and it makes the regulation, you know, absolutely meaningless, but it's not overly restrictive so that potentially there's no room for innovation or, you know, it becomes overly burdensome, or more important, if it's overly restricted, then it doesn't allow for that sort of common agreement upon how to use it, right? So it's becomes sort of an analytical philosopher sort of question, right? It's not just semantics, but it's vital to having the right process. Right now, to the wider public, including many of the leaders globally, when you ask them what AI is now, it's ChatGPT, full stop, right? Which is false. In fact, it may be a large portion in terms of the AI that's being used globally, but it's actually, you know, if you think of a pie chart, a very small, and I don't know the exact percentage of that artificial intelligence there, right? And by the way, it's one of the reasons why it's ineffective, and you need RAG, you might need layered systems of AI, et cetera. But no, I think that you're asking the right sort of questions. That it's the difficulty is coming out in a way that would be, I think, agreeable by everyone to be able to address it. And yeah, I don't know if Lance, if you had.
Just leave it there. If there's another question, yeah.
Thank you. Since you mentioned ChatGPT, I'm more focused on the society and the impacts on society itself. Very naive question, like, are there really institutions or someone doing concrete stuff to spread awareness, or I guess what's called AI literacy? Because I know there are some like sustainable development goal and these OECD, what do you call, that's part of the plan, but it's most of the time that's just part of the plan and never really gets to the practice. And I feel like many people, many research or students or private or public sectors are focusing on, okay, developing AIs and trying to regulate, trying to follow up what private people are developing, trying to make the least amount of damages everywhere. And again, I think not so many people are focusing on the normal people and society, so that's my concern actually. Because I'm also always more optimistic person, but right now I try to be optimistic, but I really cannot sometimes, and it's very, very scary. And I'm trying to maybe ask you, like, if you know on the high levels, if something is really happening to help us normal people.
Yeah, great question. And you're right, like a lot of the conversation does tend to get, a lot of the oxygen in the room does go to like the public sector or private sector innovation. And then you think about like, what about us normal people? What about the people that are using this? And so short answer to your question, yes, and it's growing. So from the ground level, the organic level, there are NGOs or charities or nonprofits or even sometimes they tend to be self-serving, but there are philanthropic arms of private sector entities that are thinking about this from a like a bottom-up common perspective of AI literacy, technology literacy. A lot of them are educational NGOs working with students, including my organization, PART. We have an educational arm where we do teach this to K through 12 students in our region. But there's also a huge amount of work that needs to be done in the community as well for, again, I referenced my mother earlier with her flip phone, you know, to be able to prove to them that this isn't necessarily a first order scary thing, that this can be a good thing when used properly and regulated well and really understood. And so what I think actually needs to happen is it's like a two-pronged approach. So you said the words AI literacy, and I totally agree, tech literacy, digital literacy, AI literacy. You need to understand first and foremost, like how to use it. So you know, prompt engineering is a term that got really exciting for like 6 months and then it died really quickly. But like prompt engineering is a thing, you could call it what you want, but how to prompt it and then how to re-prompt or keep going along those lines is one thing. So it's like how to use it. But then the other bit of literacy that I think is really well, they're both really like underserved, but another side is then like, how do you interpret it? How do you take with what was given and be able to assess in your mind, okay, like I know these things to be true, or this makes sense to me, these sources can be correct, I'm not sure about that, and along these lines. And so I think that it's really a two-pronged approach, and this is what we teach, you know, the folks that we serve and partners that we've dealt with, and there are organizations around the world that are trying to do this. It's how to use the technology, then how to interpret the technology's outputs, so inputs and outputs. And there are, you mentioned OECD, you mentioned Sustainable Development Goals, like even the massive macro international organizations that we talked about, that was a theme of one of the questions or two, they are also saying to themselves, you know, for example, the United Nations. So they have the Sustainable Development Goals. They're more than 50% of the way through their timeline that they gave themselves. And they have published the fact that they think they're like 15% or so, their Sustainable Development goals have been 15% accomplished or 15% addressed. And they're like, that's 85% that we are failing and we have less than 50% left. The only way we are going to make meaningful, measurable dents into these goals, how we're going to make progress, is by harnessing artificial intelligence tools. And so it's a multi-pronged thing. How are you going to think about solving giant questions about climate change, or giant questions about poverty, or giant questions about disease eradication if you can't take a bunch of data and process it? So that's the one thing. But then also it's a call to arms to say, like, these organizations say, we don't know how to do it. We need the world to help us figure this out, private sector, NGO sector, public sector engagement as well. And to do that, there needs to be this level of education that you were talking about. So it's got to really contribute from the ground up. So it's very complex and it's very challenging. And it's like this ecosystem, like web of analysis that needs to occur, and a lot of web work that needs to work out. But yes, like to your question, ultimately, there is some educational outputs out there. Happy to share some with you and tell you some of the organizations that are working on them. But there's a lot of work to be done. So again, another plug for research.
We're about out of time, so I'll just give Dave a last word, and then feel free to stick around and keep chatting.
So I want to continue to pull the thread on this education question, because I think it's extremely relevant and in a number of areas. So what we hear about things, whether we're talking about the sustainment goals or things like cancer in the medical field, is that the promise is that AI is going to solve these. Right, but no one's talking about exactly how. The expectation from, look, it seems to be from the tech companies that, hey, we're going to develop the technology and you all smart people will figure out how to apply it in this case. And there are research groups, and Lance did, I think, a fantastic job just laying out all the kinds, the different flavors, if you would, of organizations that are thinking seriously about the impact of artificial intelligence and how we do this. But this question, regardless of your organization and you know, the field that you're in, it resonates. So even when we were working with the Army, there's this goal as part of the AI strategy broadly is the workforce development. How do we get the expertise, right, to educate and train the experts within the Army? And as Lance heard me say a number of occasions, I want to extend that. Certainly we need the experts, but who's talking about the AI for the every person? Who's talking about how we educate everybody across the board, because regardless of where she sits in the life cycle, she's going to have an impact and needs to understand what it can do, what it can't do. So certainly the benefits, the opportunities, but also what's the limitations and risks associated with it relative to the work that she's doing. So even in our new AI path moving forward, right, that President Trump has signed and talks about raising the AI education level, across America. But the devil's in the details in it. How do we go about doing that? Do we rely on some, famous, public or private sector entities to be part of that? Or do we bring in a conversation, this gets to this kind of this diversity piece, to get the experts from these different stakeholders around the table? Because do we want to leave it up to individual sub-school systems figuring out what's best for us? And then when we think of ourselves as individuals, right, you might be a parent or maybe one day be a future parent, like how do you want to best prepare your child to navigate a world where AI becomes ubiquitous in all aspects of it and understands, and perhaps it may be the case that right now we're only setting the conditions that the next generation and generation after are not only going to have to live with those decisions, but hopefully we've done enough of the groundwork, done enough of the research to set them up in a sense where they're able to live lives that are flourishing and not make a wrong decision today that's going to stifle that. And it requires resources, it requires will. I think that pointing to one organization to try to pin the rose and say that you're going to be responsible for it, I don't think it's going to work that way. So it's going to be a combination of grassroots as well as the other piece. But I think that's an absolutely vital just line of thinking going forward. And we haven't even talked about the impact on our other global resources, right? Water consumption, electricity, and everything, in terms of what seems to be required, sort of the darker side of all this that's going on, which has a huge impact as well.
Very important. Yeah, if we had more time, I think we could just keep going.
We'll talk about that next time.
But we'll end it here. And again, feel free to keep chatting. And big thank you to Lance and Dave for coming to talk to us. And thank you all for joining the conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks.